And joining us now on our book talk segment, great to welcome a man who's written a very fascinating book that's very well in the hardcover, actually named the best book of 2017 by both the Washington Post and Wall Street Journal, just out in paperback this month. It's called Behave, The Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst. We're joined today by Robert M. Sapolsky, and a very interesting man. He's a Stanford primatologist, neurobiologist, and a very interesting book he has written. We're going to talk about it right now, and he joined us by telephone. Robert, good to talk with you. How are you?
Good, thanks. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I had a chance to I didn't get a chance to read all of it because it's quite lengthy, but I'm looking forward to reading the rest of it. But, boy, what a fascinating topic. First of all, congratulations on the success of the hardcover book. That's a nice honor for you.
Well, it's mostly pleasing not to have to be writing it anymore. This was a long process.
I was going to say, when you write a book like that, obviously it's a science type of book. There's a lot of research that goes into it. What was the first of all? How long did it take for the manuscript the first time, and how long did you kind of work on it?
Well, I've been collecting notes for it for decades. I mean, this is kind of the subject I've spent my whole career thinking about. In terms of actually writing it, I sort of closed up my lab about 4 years ago in order to sit in my living room for 4 years and crank this out. So, yeah, it's been a lot of time doing spell checking and such.
And there's so much, obviously, that goes into it when you tackle a subject like human beings. We're the most complicated creatures, I guess, in the world, right? Even more than, the highest animals. So there's a lot to go on there, right?
Yep, and often, some of the time is the challenge of recognizing just how unique we are. Some of the time the challenge is recognizing how we're just built on the same blueprint as everyone else, just seeing the continuity between us and other species.
Well, when you tackle a subject like this, obviously you have an idea in mind what you want to do, but as you go along, I imagine you're surprised yourself, right, about what you find out, aren't you?
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the things that comes through is just the sense of how much of biological influences there are in our behavior, but we haven't a clue they're relevant at all. I mean, say, writ large in terms of just a long-lasting one, the amount of stress hormones you were exposed to back when you were a fetus as a function of how stressed your mother was, the amount of stress hormones there will affect all sorts of aspects of your physiology and behavior 50, 60 years later. Or flipped another way in terms of much shorter-term effects, when you're hungry, when you're tired, when you're stressed, when you're frazzled in some ways, you're making totally different moral decisions than you do in other circumstances. And it's got to do with the fact that different parts of your brain are working differently under those settings. In other words, fetal life, what was going on in your brain 2 seconds ago, everything in between, and further from that in time, and all of those are influencing the biology of what we wind up doing.
Yeah, I thought it was fascinating. The parts of the book that I happen to actually get to read through, like you said, how much influence in your life comes from your first year or two of life that you carry for the rest of your life, and can you change that, or can you overcome if it's a negative thing? Can you do it, or how difficult is that to do? Right?
Well, one of the themes that comes through is something people have managed to figure out some time ago is childhood matters, and different types of childhoods produce very different adults, and where we're making a lot of progress is understanding sort of the nuts and bolts biology of how do different childhood experiences change your brain, change your hormonal systems, change the way your genes are regulated. And one of the themes that comes out of that is how many of these jargon in the field, how many of these epigenetic changes are long-lasting, even lifelong. What we're also coming to appreciate, as you say, is ways in which some of these changes can be reversed. There's not a whole lot in the biology of our behavior that is unchangeably set in stone, a field now known as neuroplasticity. Your brain could change in all sorts of ways, but with that comes sort of a simple kind of soundbite which is when you look at some of the adverse consequences of like rotten things happening to you in childhood, the longer you wait to try to intervene, the more of an uphill battle it's going to be to try to fix it.
Yeah, I guess as an adult, if you never really tackled something that happened when you were a child that might have been traumatic or long-going traumatic experiences, it's harder when you're in your 40s or 50s to fix it than if you were in your teens. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. But it can be done, but it's much more difficult, right? What you mentioned, just what happens in your brain as a child, or even before that when you're in the womb. I guess fears are a lot of things people have. The childhood fears. You hear that term a lot, and that's part of genetic makeup, I guess. But it's also part of how you're brought up. So what is it, about 50-50? You think genetic and how you're brought up determines what you're going to be like?
Well, what you're getting at is like one of the most important issues out there: genes versus environment, nature versus nurture, and the simplest sort of answer to that question, which of course is like insanely complicated in the process, is you really can't separate the influences. It's useless to ever ask what a gene does. You ask what a gene does in the particular environment. And it's useless to ask what the effects of a particular environment are. You instead have to ask what those effects are with somebody with a particular genetic makeup. Gene-environment interaction like crazy. Okay, one great example of this, there's this gene, totally obscure term for the three people who care about it. It's the gene coded for something called monoamine oxidase alpha. It's got something to do with brain chemistry. Amino alpha gene comes in two different flavors, two different versions, and a ton of lab research with animals had shown that if you have one of those versions, you are more prone towards violence. Okay, so how about in humans? What did it look like? Massive studies following thousands of people for decades of their life. And it turns out if you've got the bad, scary version of that gene, by adulthood, yes, indeed, you are more likely to have a history of antisocial violence. If and only if you were abused as a child. If it wasn't coupled with an abusive childhood environment, doesn't matter which version of the gene you have. In other words, it's not the gene, it's not the environment, it's the interaction between the two. Really powerful demonstration of that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. It's one of the main points of the book, the neurobiology of emotions, right? What causes somebody to either be good or what more importantly causes somebody to be evil. So you just kind of explained that a little bit there. That comes from that. Perhaps that gene is a big part of it, right?
Well, genes like that, but genes that work in different ways in different environments.
It's a fascinating book. We'll love to have you on again down the road. We have a little more time, but I think we touched on a few things. I hope our audience will get more information if they get the book. It's called Behave, The Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst. And we've been talking with Robert M. Sapolsky today. And Robert, do you have a website you can direct people to? They can get more information about the book?
I don't. I'm very primitive. I'm sort of in the Stone Age, but like bookstores and Amazon and all the usual book buying places have it available. And as you noted, it just came out in softcover.
Well, we'll have a link on our website and the link to the Amazon and all that. People can get it. But Robert, pleasure talking to you. I hope you have another project. You'll take a little rest and then start something else, right?
Well, might as well spend another half-decade obsessing over something, so we'll see. But thank you for having me on.
Thanks, Robert. We'll talk to you soon.
Good. Take care.